Welcome back to Potter's Pockets, episode 01010, our 10th episode. And we are back today with Miss Sarah Miller and Mr. Wesley Schantz to talk about Chapter 6, Gilderoy Lockhart, 7, Mudbloods and Murmurs, 8, The Deathday Party. And it is truly a pleasure to have both of you on at the same time now.
Hooray!
Oh, man.
So what the listeners aren't getting right now, but maybe what they can hear in our voices, is that we all are like Ron with his broken wand right now using this technology together. And we recently just had to do some serious investigative work to figure out how to get all three of us onto this podcast. But you know what? We did it.
Hooray!
Yeah.
And
so
no slugs.
and no slugs.
Anywhere.
Yeah. No, it's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing. And so, y'all, just to sort of dive into this episode, we get some insight into Gilderoy Lockhart's teaching style. We also, if
so
you
to
can
speak.
and we also sort of start to discover a creeping dark underbelly to not only Hogwarts and its history, but also to the wizarding community too. We find some words of denigration, both squib and mudblood, and some differing perceptions on hierarchy within the wizarding community. It seems as if some wizards believe that wizards from pure blood, rather than mudblood, which none should say because it's a terrible word, are better suited for magic, are more trustworthy. And we learn from Professor Benz, Mr. Wes Shantz's favorite professor of all people, that Salazar Slytherin, the head of the Slytherin house, one of the first founders of Hogwarts, believed that Hogwarts should be a little bit. And then, well, lo and behold, we have an attack at Hogwarts. And so, y'all, what are we thinking about this second book and this our, I believe, third podcast on it now? What is it that y'all wanted to focus on today?
I think we can start with Lockhart again, and his relationship to the mysterious goings on so far. We see him sort of following Harry around, or going places that Harry might tend to go, much the same way that Colin and Colin and Ginny, I guess, right? So they sort of have this unusual little accompaniment to all of Harry's movements this time around. So it's not like immediately clear that that's related to the dark underbelly, but it seems like it is a little bit similar, at least. And if Gilderoy Lockhart has something dark about him, it seems to be his very effort to be, agreeable to everybody, right? To be a delightful, chummy teacher. His attempt to be good is what makes him bad, or something like that. If that makes sense.
Well, definitely his attempt to be famous or to be a star or to stand out seems to be something that doesn't make him work well within a team. Because if we look at him as a teacher who has a specific subject to teach, then the best thing he can do is teach that subject. But what we see about him is he attempts to teach or to outstrip Professor Sprout when it comes to herbology. Not going to happen. He then steps on Hagrid's toes a bit, trying to give him recommendations on how to, I think, engorge his pumpkins. That's not going to help very much. And then he even suggested he could make a potion in the presence of Severus Snape, who we know from the sixth book is a brilliant potions master. And so what's sort of interesting about him is that what he attempts to do is to seem as if he's a master of all, and yet what we see from his first lesson is that he seems to be a master of none. He can't even deal with Cornish pixies, nor is he capable of teaching the students how to deal with the Cornish pixies, potentially, and perhaps I'll suggest this to you as teachers, because he doesn't know what he's doing. And so he doesn't know how to teach them how to do what it is they should be doing. So what did y'all think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny every time, like, the narrator or another character sort of dismisses his interjections. Well, if I had been there, I would have known exactly the counter curse for that. And they give him like the side eye, or they just start ignoring him. Eventually, his I think it's in like chapter 8, maybe it's in chapter 9, but eventually his assessment, I think it's chapter 9, get reduced to like a parenthetical note, like what he said in conference with all these teachers. Oh, and like it becomes just a running joke, which maybe is something that he is as well, like a running joke to them. But I do think like there's something about his I'm not gonna have the right word for it, but the way that he shows off when he clearly doesn't have like a depth of knowledge that would deserve or warrant showing off. I feel like when people really know things, they either don't feel the need to show off or they don't. Like the parading of his knowledge is a clue that he doesn't have it. But also I think it's really sophomoric, and it reminds me a lot of the way Harry pretends like the younger kids are somehow beneath him, right? Like, I know this. Like, I know this. I don't need you around to have like awe and wonder at these things. Like, because, and at least that's what I see as a teacher with sophomores, is the boastful, I would have known exactly what to do in that situation. You know.
So that's excellent. So you're really bringing together a couple of threads that I was really hoping we would get to discuss. So on the one hand, Harry is now a sophomore and has that sort of inflation we've been talking about of now that they are above just one more person, they are now master of all people and all domains of knowledge. Suggesting, and so how does that manifest for Harry in this book? Through the figure of Colin, the first year Gryffindor, who follows him around and finds everything that he does interesting, and Harry doesn't have any time for him, and so that's just very interesting that you would also connect that to Lockhart, who himself draws a parallel between himself and Harry, them both being famous, and Lockhart perhaps unduly projecting the desire for fame onto Harry, thinking that Harry wants to be famous and likes fame and the spotlight in the same way that Lockhart does, and Harry thinks that he doesn't. But on the other hand, he now has sort of a fan.
He's got a few fans, right?
Yeah, and he doesn't seem to have much sympathy for Colin, even though, like you mentioned, just last year, everything was fascinating to him in this book. And since we just read the first book and didn't have to wait a year for it, we remember Harry and ourselves meeting Quidditch, meeting the moving staircases. See, I mean, when Colin says, "Oh my gosh, I can actually develop the film so that the characters in it move," it's like, that is cool, but not to Harry.
I think
please.
The other thing I would say about that is, so okay, in addition to his kind of being annoyed by Colin, he's also like really embarrassed by Ginny. And he flushes quite a bit when Hagrid says, "Well, I think she wouldn't mind an autograph photograph," you know. And it could be because you know he's right next to her big brother Ron, but I don't think he's old enough to really understand that dynamic either. But he blushes. There's a lot of people who blush in these chapters, and there's a lot of people who look blanched or pale, all the way down to the ghosts. Obviously, the ghosts can't blush. They don't have blood flow. But there's I noticed a lot of that kind of facial description of blushing with embarrassment or being blanched with embarrassment or something like that. But I would also say that, like, to your earlier point, when you were introducing these chapters about, you know, what we discover about kind of the wizarding world and its hierarchies, is that it really is kind of like, if you can have one level above someone, then you can dismiss that person below, right? And we saw that kind of at the beginning with what we learned about the house elves. I think maybe just sort of like an undercurrent of at least the first half of this book, but maybe the entirety of this book is like hierarchies and dominion and
precisely
the temptation that we feel when we have a little bit of power perhaps to make use of it against those beneath us who maybe we climbed over or whose shoulders we stand on in order to have that power. So like you turn around and you oppress the person just beneath you, never considering the fact that you are not that distinguished from them. Like I think the revelation of all of these hierarchies within the wizarding world, it's an opportunity to see kind of how do they have classes and groups of people who with a little bit of power grow covetous of more. I'm not sure if that makes any sense.
But also, I think what might be sort of an open question with exposing us to these hierarchies is what the appropriate value structure is. Because on the one hand, we see that though Malfoy is very rich and manages to make his way onto the Quidditch team because of his money, that is something that he's deeply embarrassed to hear actually articulated in his presence.
Right.
The only reason you made this team, and this is from a highly competent individual, Granger, is because you bought these brooms, which makes him he's very self-conscious about that, as we know from the conversation he had earlier before school with his father, where his father talked about how ashamed he should be because of a Muggle-born defeating him. And so we have that sort of contrast between the non-pure-blooded Hermione, who is the most talented witch of the class, but also Draco, who comes from perhaps the oldest wizarding family, but is not as competent as her and has to use wealth to move forward in his life. And so we also get, like, say, Arthur Weasley, who's very poor but has a very excellent and balanced family and very talented children, as opposed to, say, Lucius, who's very rich, but it's sort of unclear whether his son is going to amount to much without extraordinary help from his vaults. And so what I think I see in tandem with what you're saying, besides bringing up the question of hierarchy, is what should be the highest values? Like, who is actually in charge here, and or what is it that we are to aspire towards? Do we want Dracos in this world, or do we want Hermiones? Which sort of and it seems sort of like that's the fundamental disagreement between Godric Gryffindor and the original Salazar Slytherin, right? Slytherin left the school because he wanted them to be more selective, where Godric Gryffindor seemed to have had a vision of the future of Hermione showing up and said, "No, we'll keep the non-pure bloods in there." Whereas Salazar Slytherin seemed to have not cared for that very much and seemed to have sort of poisoned the well a little bit too, right?
Right.
He creates this chamber of secrets in which this horror exists that will someday take out the venomous rage of him on some poor, unsuspecting, and innocent student who it turns out we've met, unbeknownst to ourselves. Wes, what do you think about this? I'm sorry, I just had that idea and had to share it.
No, don't worry about it. I was looking at the mudblood thing, thinking about that a little bit, and a couple of thoughts about it. So the first time that we hear it is when Hermione says about that buying their way onto the team, right? And that's when Malfoy jumps to the insult. And and then the next time we hear it is at the end of the chapter, the Deathday party, where in front of pretty much the whole school, Malfoy comes out and just threatens all the mudbloods en masse as enemies of the air. Like, he sort of interprets that for us, what that phrase might mean.
Right.
So I was a little bit surprised how bold Malfoy is in, like, embracing this role as the rabble rouser here. But I also thought it was interesting how it connects with the other word that we are not supposed to say, right, which is Voldemort's name. So there's some kind of, from the beginning, I guess there's this idea, like, there's certain things which are outside of free speech, right, for one reason or another. And I think your question is apposite there. Like, what is the way that we determine what kinds of things we can say and what kind of things we shouldn't or can't or choose not to? I guess that's a way of asking you the same question you're asking.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's a great connection to the idea of Voldemort. Like, what are because it asks, like wherever we draw our boundaries as what's good and what's not, or what's acceptable, what's not, what should we seek for, what should we avoid, you like when you draw that boundary, like clearly the word mudblood or is out of bounds, right?
Yes.
But as soon as it gets used, right, it stops, like ever so slightly, it gets increasingly inbounds, right? So that boundary is not, it is porous, or it's maybe not porous, but it's flexible, because clearly by the end of 2 chapters later, he has the guts to say it in front of everybody else. Now, I mean, that sort of, to me, is sort of like, well, when that to me is like how things change and evolve, like 150 years ago, women couldn't like show their ankles. Or how certain words were not acceptable and then were acceptable and then are no longer acceptable, or that evolution, like once you sort of break that sound barrier of like, oh man, you said it out loud, maybe you realize like, oh, it's just a word and we've ascribed it enormous amounts of power. Now, I don't want to go down that road, but clearly words do have power in this book, right?
Yeah, that's true, but they only have power, and this is something I want to add in there, if they conjoin to the situation in an appropriate way. Obviously, words that in no way relate to a situation are written off. So words only gain power when they express something true about a situation, which is precisely why bad words are so bad, because they accurately describe some aspect of a situation in a way that somebody is supposed to pass over in civil discourse. So as you were saying, that these words can gain power and ascendancy over time, that's precisely because the situation in which the people speaking change over time. And so just as Hogwarts has been changing over time, it seems, now we see that on Slytherin, they have all males on the team. Every single chaser on Gryffindor is female. And we have people like Hermione acing the scores. And people like Lucius Malfoy, arch conservatives, traditionalists, do not like this.
Right.
So I think the use of this word in this moment indicates a profound tension in the magical world. There is a change happening amongst the magical folk, and how they relate to each other, and how they relate to muggles, and how they perceive muggles. And so I think that word just becomes sort of the linchpin in that situation. It kind of puts a pinpoint on what's happening, and draws, like you were saying, a dividing line between these two now competing perspectives.
It reminds me of something we talked about in our discussion of the Philosopher's Stone, right when Mr. Dursley is dropping Harry off at King's Cross for the first time, and he says something, and I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but he says something, and the narrator tells us that it was like audibly nasty or cruel. And yes. I think in our discussion, we pointed out how, like, when things are changing and you realize that you may not have the upper hand.
Yes.
Does that create like a reaction that's not logical, not rooted in reason or like humanity, but is rooted in like this visceral kind of emotional reaction of anger, and like I guess
I think you're hitting something, and I just want to connect that to what Gilderoy Lockhart does. It seems like what you're saying is, when you realize that the situation has changed to a place that you do not wish it to be, and you are powerless to change it, the only thing perhaps you can do is be nasty, is say something nasty, or to just use your words rather than to affect change through your actions. Sort of in the same way that Gilderoy Lockhart is incapable of using his magic to accomplish anything he says he does. And so obviously he talks the most of any of the professors, and yet accomplishes the least.
And I was just going to say, and aside from being nasty, like when you I think there's like a real weakness in like destructiveness, in like ending things, in breaking things. There's a real, in like drawing that dividing line and like digging it in and severing ties. I'm of course like right now I feel bad because I'm always I feel like I'm so often just thinking of like like our context as individuals in this country at this moment, but like a year ago yesterday was the march in Charlottesville, and it's hard to not associate like this mudblood nonsense with their nonsense. Do you know what I'm saying? Like and how like when you feel most threatened, and you know, like maybe in the recesses of your mind, or you haven't explored it yet, that there isn't actually a threat, you just aren't as powerful as you once were. The reaction is ugly, and it's messed up. Like, it's nasty, it's cruel, and it's divisive. I don't know, I have a hard time not seeing that connection, I suppose.
Well, and I think to your point, and I'm sorry, Wes, I know we're trying to get in. I've already spoken longer than I was going to say, but it's like, it seems like the nasty effect, the destructive effect you're mentioning there is one that nobody can control once it's out.
Right.
It's like the problem with sort of a devolving civility like that, as represented by the devolving discourse between the students and the raised level of emotion, and therefore the difficult, and then they're sort of tribalizing. They're becoming more and more rooted with their houses, and this is something we'll see later as the horror continues through. The students will spend less and less time with each other outside of houses and more time in their common room. That what happens is something that is destructive not only for one party or another, or one side or another, but for everybody.
Right.
In a way that you just cannot control.
Right.
I think there's something funny going on though with what they do when they have this conflict and Ron is spouting slugs out of his mouth. They head to Hagrid's hut, and what Hagrid feeds them is the treacle fudge. And it cements their jaws together.
Yes.
Right? So it's like there is something very interesting there. Like, what do you do when you're spouting slugs out of your mouth? You eat the treacle fudge, right? You go to Hagrid's hut. What would that mean, I guess, in this context? I don't know exactly, but it's funny. It's funny.
It means get off Facebook.
I can move on that. Yeah, no, I can actually move on that. I was thinking about this because let me run this by you and see if we can clean this up, because maybe it's not quite there, but I think it's close. I think what Ron having to eat his own slugs there, what that symbolizes is sort of how you have to eat your own words and your negative feelings in a situation like that in order to maintain peace.
Yeah.
That you have to hold it in, that if he fights, and everybody wanted to fight Draco there, how dare you, Alicia and Katie say, it's utterly foul that he said that. Unacceptable. Everybody indicated that. That's how we knew, right? It's everybody's reaction that lets us know that's a bad word. You do not say that sort of thing. And so to your point about eating the fudge that then cements their mouths closed, it seems to be that some engagements are not worth engaging with because they will lead to further conflict. And if your goal, like in the Odyssey, is peace, that sometimes you have to eat some slugs or keep your mouth closed. Yeah,
I know. I was just gonna say, when they eat the fudge and it cements their mouth shut, I thought that was just that like Hagrid was a bad cook. But
that's probably true too.
But he's also, but I mean, to get into the symbolism, isn't he like the parental figure for them, who's also not going to get them in trouble a lot, like, but sometimes going to encourage their mischief, maybe directly, maybe indirectly. So he's that parental figure who explores Diagon Alley with Harry at the beginning. So maybe he's like the older brother that Percy and Fred and George cannot be, because one is too rigid with the rules, like takes 5 points from his own brother, and one of them or two of them have their own drawer and their own freaking their own file cabinet in like the bad kid room, right? What if Hagrid is like this happy medium? Yeah. Oddly, this large happy medium between like obsession with rules and every little toe out of line and total disregard for rules. And so they go to him, and he's a compass, and he says, oh man, that's a terrible word. Like, he confirms all of the youngsters' emotional reaction, but then symbolically gets them to shut up about it. Though I guess if his jaw is cemented shut, it really shouldn't be, because he needs to like throw up all the slugs. But
I agree too, because he also checks Harry too, right? The very first thing he does is say, "Hey, I've got a bone to pick with you. I heard you were passing out signed autographs. I want one." And then Harry starts to blush and get frustrated, and that's when Hagrid knows he got him. He nailed him. He's like, "I'm just kidding with you." But that's, I mean, I don't know if y'all saw it like I did, but within the context of what Sarah just put, it's like that is sort of like a big brother checking you. I mean, I remember when at St. John's, I had the honor of being drafted my second year there in the first round of the draft by the Guardians. And then, and so,
what are you talking about? What is the Guardians?
Well, so at St. John's,
golden-hearted Guardians, the golden-souled Guardians.
I know what a Guardian is, but I'm not sure what you're talking about. Is this a sports thing?
So at St. John's, there are 4 sports teams, like there are 4 houses at Hogwarts. And in your second year at St. John's, you get drafted. And if you're drafted in the first round, that means that you're the first choice of that sports team. And so after I was drafted for the first time, I was late to the very first soccer game. Soccer is the first sport that's played during the fall at St. John's. And the athletic director of the time, Leo Pickens, saw me.
No way.
Said, "Oh, well, there we go, Schmeed. So kind of getting drafted in the first round and now going all Manny Ramirez, huh? And, can't show up at the right time." And, he was razzing me. He was letting me know that from my actions, it looked as if it had gone to my head. That I had been picked early like that. And I sort of see that as what an authority figure, particularly male on male, in this case does. And, the fact that Hagrid would sort of make fun of Harry in that case, it strikes me as a sort of keeping him in line, making sure that he's not becoming more like Gilderoy Lockhart. Like, that's not the sort of person you are, Harry.
Well, right. Like, to that point, I mean, when he does blush, it happens a few other times in these chapters where you blush. Like, I mean, sometimes you blush from being embarrassed, right? Or like everybody's looking at you and you're on stage and you forgot the words or whatever. And that's embarrassing. But insofar as like stuff like that being used to kind of, I don't know, publicly shame in a way, but without the, red letter A kind of connotation shame. But like, it's a really good tool for reminding people, especially I think young people, about where the line is. And
it's much softer than a howler. It's
way softer. I mean, and I say this having taught at an all-boys school for 8 years. I'll tell you what, like a little dose of public shame, like, oh, you forgot your book today? Huh. Interesting. How do you intend to explore the text with us today? Oh, you don't? Oh, okay. Well, maybe you can ask for the notes from a friend. Thanks for joining. Or thanks for playing. Like that kind of like, and it embarrasses them a little bit, not a lot, because they have a healthy ego. And it works to, I mean, you can't do it a lot and you can't go extreme, but like it works to to check them into place, which at this moment in their sophomoric time, they need that. I think that's the kind of, I mean, they don't need to know where the dining hall is anymore. They know where that is. There are new things that they need to learn, and like learn your place or learn what is expected of you and how not to disappoint people.
That's very interesting. I hadn't even thought of that. And I was wanting to ask about the Deathday party, but kind of what you just said there about learning your place and having new things to learn. And as we know from the new herbology lab, that's true. It's sort of like what each year of school is, especially at Hogwarts, is entering territory you think is known territory, but is actually unknown territory. And so it's like your map of the situation gets more sophisticated every year, right? Because, okay, now you know about Hagrid and a magical ceiling, and you know all your classes, and you know the professors a little bit, but how well do you really know any of this? And it looks like starting to get some of the nuances of the wizarding community is sort of showing us that when you first learn something, you learn sort of the big swathes, the general picture, the first pass approximation, the psychologists would call it. but that as you start to delve in and really investigate the picture, the things become more nuanced, more mature, more sophisticated. And that perhaps that's something that the sophomore, as wise, sophos, moros, fool, is just now coming to knowledge of. It's like they're getting an inkling of how things work and that there is a deeper level of knowledge or a deeper level to everything in their lives, but they're not yet articulate enough to really put it into words, to grasp it. They can sense it in some way.
The way that works, I think it's interesting that Hagrid is the one that is able to put things in perspective for them, because I think he experiences this on a, as you guys are describing, like another level of prejudice that he's had to experience, being of mixed giant and human race, as we learn later, right? So he sort of can observe and see the components of what they're going through, and yet he can sort of step outside that or see it from a different standpoint.
So he's like a natural exile. He has a pride of place, an external and internal perspective. Interesting.
He also, or Filch also shows us this too, right? So there's his his turn to blush brick red when Harry sees the correspondence course that he's doing, Quickspell, right? And it's got this like fancy font which really jumps off the page.
Curly letters.
Yeah. It's fun, of course, and beginners magic, and there's tips for how to hold your wand. Holding your wand, some useful tips. So it's like clearly putting it on a really humorous perspective of it, and Filch is not the most sympathetic character, but at the same time, you see it from this other angle, and then it starts to hit home maybe a bit later, like how serious this is for him. We see it also with the Deathday party, right? So it's like this thing that is so strange and bizarre, where Nick is trying to be part of the headless hunt or whatever, right? So it's something that, again, is like way outside of Harry and his friends' actual experience, but it's the same thing, right? It's this inability to enter into a world that you thought belonged to you, or you thought you knew, right?
So that's interesting. So that makes me wonder which direction. This is a dawning thought, but so if the magical world was that wonderful escape from Harry from a terrible place into a good place, perhaps what he's now getting to perceive is that is only his experience of the magical world, but not everybody's. Because for some people, the magical world, or precisely what they desire, is precisely that which seems to be denied to them. Just as Filch wishes to be magical, so does nearly headless Nick wish to be headless Nick. And I'm wondering, because we learned that headless Nick he had his head chopped off by a blunt axe. It hit something like 5 times.
Right.
And it makes me wonder, in conjunction with Filch attempting to take this sort of like late night infomercial, learn magic quickly. And I mean, we even get testimonials there, right? And again, we have advertising mentioned here, and perception affecting reality. My charms, my wife used to laugh at, and now they're great, is the sort of thing that we read on there. And sort of the idea we get is that when you want something that has been denied to you so bad, you might be willing to believe things that aren't true in order to acquire it. This will fix your hair, and like, you can grow this hair back. It's not just the magical community that is subject to this. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is, it seems as if what you're suggesting is that Harry's perspective on not just how things work within the magical community is changing, but what the magical community is to those who are part of it, and those who wish to be a part of it might be as well. I don't know. It's rough. It's rough at this point. But so I mean, yeah. So the Deathday party, we have, and this is something we were sort of talking about before we got on air, was I was sort of mentioning to Wes, it looks like we have sort of a formula in these first 2 books, at least at the beginning. You're not at Hogwarts. and then magical things start to happen, and then you have to get there, and there's a getting there, and then once you're there, you meet your professors, and then you have a Halloween thing happen, and then something funny happens during Halloween, and then it's like Christmas. And so this time in Halloween, we don't have the wonderful feast. We do see it off in the corner, but we have a descent into the underworld, right? It's the 500th death day of nearly headless Nick. I hope he doesn't hear me say that. And we don't know whether to be happy or sad on this day, which is sort of funny because maybe that's how it is at a very good funeral too. You know, and you are certainly happy to see all the people that loved someone, but also sad to see them go. But so I was just sort of wondering what y'all wanted or what you saw in this death day. Why are we taken down to the ghosts and seeing the bloody Baron and Peeves, who's all colored, whereas everybody else is drawn? And why is it that Harry, Ron, and Hermione are torn down into this new thing that many mortals don't get to see, but is not enjoyable for mortals at all? And in fact, we see that sort of recurring myth of an underworld having food that you can't eat in it, but they don't want to eat the food in this underworld because it's all moldy and gross. So what did y'all see down here in this 8th chapter of this second book?
Well, we do meet Moaning Myrtle, which seems important. Right? So she's another character who is mocked for something. We don't fully know what it's about just yet, but Peeves takes something pretty harmless that Hermione says and uses it against her, right? So again, this chance to pick on some minority or outsider or whatever is highlighted here again for like humorous effect, but it makes Hermione feel pretty bad. And of course, we'll see more about that later. But I also thought it was interesting how the Deathday party gives us maybe for the first time, I've been paying that close attention, but it gives us a time frame for the book, right? Because it's the 500th death day, and it dates his death in 1492.
Yeah.
So that gives us a contemporaneity to the story. We can sort of like calculate from there when things are supposed to take place. And so I think it's not really out of the realm of like, it seems like the book is encouraging us to think about contemporary political or social issues with respect to the kinds of things it brings up, because it places it in our time, like very explicitly there in the 90s. So
yeah, I thought one of the reasons, I mean, so Alex and Wes, you guys are more well versed in this than I am, but like they go to the depths of the castle. As I understand it, it's in the basement, I think.
One of the dungeons, I think.
It's in one of the dungeons. So a couple things, like Wes already mentioned, they meet Moaning Myrtle, who, and that's like an author's way of like flashing you a quick clue. Like you get introduced to somebody who's going to be important, but in a way that doesn't make them important. Makes them memorable, but not seemingly significant. But so that's like a trick of, a storytelling, I assume. But I think also being in the dungeon and then he hears the voice, I think maybe that's where he needs to hear the voice, as opposed to like if they were at the feast, maybe he wouldn't have heard anything. Right. It would have been loud. They would have been warm. They would have been full, maybe getting sleepy because they were really full. And like he may not have ever like had a moment where he was like in a quiet enough space to be able to hear that. I think that's part of why they're there. But I would also assume that there's like some kind of illusion happening to when you like any of the stories where somebody descends to the underworld, right? So I know it happens in the Odyssey, and it happens in the Inferno, and it happens in the Aeneid. That like you go and there's something that the character needs to acquire there.
Yes.
Like usually some kind of knowledge, but also maybe like I don't know, a thing, an object. Maybe that's not the case, but like a kind of knowledge, but not just a knowledge of of the world, but more of like a knowledge of oneself. So like who you're destined to become, in the case of Aeneas, or how to recognize hate and then therefore avoid sin for Dante or something like that. But I guess
So what is it for Harry?
I guess I'm not quite sure what that would be for him, aside from recognizing that Nick is having this party where clearly he's not the most important person at the party. You know, and like, I don't know, maybe is he supposed to learn compassion for the outsider, for the other? I don't know if that's too cliche, or but given what we've been talking about, all of these characters who, like Wes said, are like semi rejected, or outsiders enough that they can see on the inside. I mean, they're also outsiders at this party, right? They're the only people who are alive. And how better to cultivate some compassion than to actually have to walk in, like, to be what somebody else struggles with every day, right? So struggle with like, the food here sucks, I'm cold, I don't have anybody to talk to. I mean,
I think I see. I think you're getting at it. So I guess one of the troubles of Harry, and one of the great temptations of him in the second book, is to identify with his fame, even though he hasn't really earned the right to be famous through his own sort of conscious actions. And so part of what maybe this scene is doing for him is helping him to identify with the losers as well, the ones who haven't done so well. So perhaps what part of this is helping him to attain is a balanced perspective. In fact, directly because he was at the Deathday party, he is again very suspiciously found at the scene of a crime, which because of circumstances makes perfect sense that he would want to do something mean to Mrs. Norris because of his recent negative interaction with Filch, and potentially, and I think this is how Filch actually sees it, because of his sort of potentially Slytherin-esque looking down on Filch for being a squib. And so I think that's what Filch, and I mean, Filch really reacts very strongly to thinking his cat is dead, and, you know, with good reason, because she seems to be the only creature in the world that can stand him. And as Wes said, not very sympathetic. But I'm wondering, because I'm having trouble with that too. I'm not entirely clear on what the treasure that's hard to attain is that is taken from the underworld of sorts of the Deathday party.
I mean, I guess to follow up on what you were saying and what I was just saying is that, like, I think it's easy for Harry to think of himself as an outsider, right? Because he has like this mark on his head, and he has this tragic past, and I think it makes him feel like he is outside looking in, especially like when he's at the Burrow, right? And I'm an outsider, you know, but at Hogwarts he's not an outsider. He's the cool kid. He's the youngest person on the Quidditch team. He's got somebody already has a crush on him, and he's only 12, and like, and he's got followers. He's got the teachers on his side, with all but one exception. You know, like he is in a way that he may not quite understand or be comfortable, and so any type of I don't know, I think that there's something to like him needing to understand how crappy it is to be outside, and like maybe being in the dungeon, the treasure is maybe less a thing, or
I see. Yes,
it's maybe less like an object, or even like an encounter that gives him the knowledge or the treasure that he needs to get from the underworld, but that's the only place he can be to ultimately be found at this sketchy scene of the crime, which eventually it will ostracize him for months from his.
You're right. And I think so. Thinking of the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and the Inferno, it seems like each of the protagonists who go down into those underworlds, what they have to do is they have to give up the world for a moment. They have to exit outside from their lives in order to realize their purpose in life, and their direction going forward. And so what Harry seems to get, like you're saying, from being an outsider here is the necessary perspective to oh, I had it, but I'm losing it, is the necessary perspective to understand the value of what he actually has. It is only by stepping outside yourself or your situation or that which protects you for a moment, like your kingdom, that enables you to actually see what it is that you love in your kingdom. Something I often said in college, I was in New Orleans and then Milwaukee, but not Atlanta, where I grew up, is, and I would often say this to try and be romantic, but is you have to leave the place you're from in order to realize what you really loved about it. And so,
and man, do I understand that.
yeah. Do you want to maybe tell everybody that what's just happened in your life?
I mean, yeah, I guess I just moved back to Seattle. But no, I mean, like, it's home. That's home. Yeah. I knew that from the minute I left and like went to Notre Dame, where there are no mountains and there's no water and there's nobody wearing Birkenstocks and nobody listening to Nirvana. So, but even in leaving DC in the last couple months, I really enjoyed as much of DC and the people there as I possibly could. And it made the leaving really hard. Right. Yeah. But like, I was just going to say, like, why does he decide to go to the Deathday party in the first place? Tim, when I read that, like, does that maybe give us a clue as to what he needs to get from there? I mean, because like in these other in these other myths about travels to the underworld, I mean, I think Odysseus has to go to the underworld, and then Aeneas is compelled because he doesn't do anything of his own choice. He just
it is a prophecy. Yes.
There's a prophecy, and everybody and his mom, he prays, and like boom, there's his mom as a white dove, and she finds the golden bough, and it's like, wow, you really worked hard for that one. But I hate Aeneas. I'm sorry.
So many people do. You're in a long line of people like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. It's something I read in one of the secondary literature pieces by, I think, Farrell, is that it's been a great sport of scholars throughout time to take pot shots at the Aeneid and at Aeneas.
But I was just going to say, like,
I think you're totally right, because what gets him to the Deathday party is the fact that he has tracked mud into into Hogwarts. Filch catches him and is going to write him up for another detention. But at the moment that he's doing that, he hears Peeves and goes off to get Peeves, because Peeves is a bigger issue than Harry, and so Harry's all forgotten. But it turns out that Sir Nick has put Peeves up to this and saved Harry's butt. And so something I wanted to bring up, and maybe this is superficial, but I'm not sure, is that sort of what Nick is introducing Harry to, rather than sort of a top-down sort of mentor-mentee or teacher-student relation, is more of an adult reciprocal relationship here. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. It's like, I did this nice thing for you, but it's not a nice thing for you. It's something I did for you because I could really use some help from you myself.
Well, but on the other hand, like, Harry, I get the vibe, like, if he really is, like, having kind of a strong not powerful, but like a healthy sense of self and ego, like, I mean, isn't it kind of something that he does out of like, oh man, I guess I owe this guy this thing. Yeah,
no, it's a real sense of reciprocity.
But like out of pity, that's like, I guess I'll go to this guy's party, I don't know, like, I owe him. It's not like we're really friends.
It's so interesting too, because he could learn so much there, right? Like, he could learn about the nature of mortality from the ghost. He could ask, what happens to you that you become a ghost? Where are my parents' ghosts? Like, what did you experience on the other side? Like, you could find out so much potentially, and yet he's thinking about it, I think, in the terms you're describing. Like, I said I'd do this, so I guess I gotta go. Like,
sort of like school itself.
No, it's great, and Hermione reminds him that he promised to go, and so it's sort of like he has to keep his word. He's supposed to help. He's supposed to help Nick make it onto the Headless Hunt, by putting in a good word with Sir Patrick but Sir Patrick sees through it right away because Harry doesn't, actually try that hard. It's
And
really just like so underwhelming.
Is that what he? I mean, I don't know if that's what he's supposed to learn, but like, I think he overlooks these people who are outsiders. I think not understand, like, maybe that's because he is such an insider, but like people like doesn't understand Filch's sensitivity, or doesn't understand Nick's desire to be in the Headless Hunt, or Colin Creevy, or whatever. But couldn't he use his fame for good? Like, couldn't he use it to? I thought about that when they were in like Diagon Alley, and they go to the Weasleys' vault, and there's like nothing in it. Like, couldn't you? I mean, what if you are famous? What responsibility do you have to those around you who are overlooked by the very people who give you attention over them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
With his detention with Lockhart, it's like an example of how not to give back, right? It's like sit there and have someone else write your thank you letters while you spout off about how great you are again. So it's like we see, there is this like deep question about what does Harry do with his fame? Does he pretend it's not there? Does he try to get away from it? Does he try to make the most of it? Like, that seems to be the reverse of these like negative versions of outsiders, right? So when you're at the top, like, what do you do with that?
And then maybe
can't get away from it, because even at the Deathday party, you can't get away from it, right? So,
but his fame also isn't enough to get nearly headless Nick into the community. Like, a good word from Harry, like a nice recommendation from a teacher, is sometimes not enough to get what you want, even if it was out of the kindness of it, wasn't a tit for tat reciprocity thing. His fame is insufficient to achieve the goal. I don't know, maybe that's like the mini lesson.
Well, what's interesting about that is that something I think Wes and I think you brought up in our first book is that sort of the process of incanting a spell is both doing something new and rooting oneself in tradition at the same time through a wooden wand, and that a spell is words with power that affect reality. But what we're seeing in this text are words that do not have the power to change reality. That, in fact, regardless of some things, regardless of what you say, some things simply cannot be changed.
Yeah.
And perhaps even, and maybe this is the end of chapter 8. We see that emphasized by the fact that Albus Dumbledore, the figure I've often said is identified with sort of the God the Father figure, capable of changing the petrified state of Miss Norris without access to a potion. Sort of like there's an interplay between that which civilization or society is capable of doing and altering, but there's also an underlying nature that simply cannot be altered. Like with Filch, if he's a squib, which means he doesn't have magic, sorry, Filch, nobody can change that. Nick, if you're already dead and your head wasn't cut off, well, it doesn't matter who says what about you. You can't play headless croquet.
And no amount of money is gonna get Draco Malfoy better. No, I was just gonna.
No, that's really good. That's right. I'm laughing because it's right. That's good.
No amount of money is gonna make him smarter than Hermione. Like, none of it, unless like not even the greatest tutors in the world, or the greatest quick spells in the world is gonna make him like get better marks than her, right?
Right. Oh no, so her talent is supreme.
And I just that makes the use of those words to me all the more weak. Because it's not an act of power to tear someone down with a nasty word. What is an act of power is to wave your wand and say an incantation. I think that's interesting. That's powerful. That's creative. It requires focus and intelligence, but to just to tear someone down, like that's weak. I don't know.
Right. Well, Wes, do you want to maybe give us some closing thoughts before we skedaddle off this time until we go back to the dormitories before class for next time?
The thing I brought up earlier, which I think ties in here about Harry being able to say Voldemort's name, and Harry, of course, hearing this voice that no one else seems to be able to hear.
Kill, rip, meat, blood.
Yeah, pretty chilling, right? That seems to connect here with the way that Draco is trying to tear people down by saying mudbloods, which other people are afraid or disgusted by, right? Even saying, much less taking that attitude towards them. It does seem like Harry has got to figure out a way to bridge or use his superior abilities, his courage, his experience facing Voldemort, and surviving, and actually like get that across to people in a way that could even for someone like Draco sort of change their mind. That seems to be like, again, the last or the ultimate challenge or lesson that these books are sort of leading us towards in lots of ways. So I just want to like restate that, I guess, and keep watching for it.
Interesting. And perhaps what we'll also see as this text goes on is that the fame that he seems so quick to want to push aside, when it turns negative, perhaps he'll miss the positive and the happy looks that people gave him, though as unwarranted as potentially they were. Interesting to keep in mind is perhaps the worst thing that can happen when one is famous is not that one loses one's fame, but that one's fame turns to infamy. And then the recognition that one once had, which was such a positive force in one's life, becomes, essentially one of the most negative forces possible for a human to have to endure, which is negative public opinion of oneself. All right, y'all. Well, I feel like this is an excellent conversation, and I think I have many thoughts in my head now that I did not have before I came in here. So your spells, your incantations are really doing some work on me. And so
I would agree. I'll say that. Good job, everyone. I learned a lot. Also, I think it's cool. I read the book, like I couldn't put it down. The second one, while I was on my road trip. So now, like we've had this conversation, and the one that we had about a week ago, when I was in South Bend, it makes me I think I'm just gonna have to go back and just, now that these ideas are, it's gonna, as Wes said, it's gonna be like a lens to keep reading, something to keep looking for. So now I need to go back and reread it again.
So mandrakes have been planted in all of our pots.
That's right.
Very
wait
good.
for them to mature.
Yeah. Okay. So for next time, then, how about 9 and 10? Do we want to make it to the dueling club? 11.
I think 9. I think we should go 9 through 11 because there's some things in 9 that will relate very nicely to things in 11.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay.
I think.
All right. Well, then that sounds excellent. Well, y'all, let's make sure that the horror doesn't catch us, and back to the dorms then. So it was a pleasure, as usual.
Sounds good. Yeah. Take it easy, fellas.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
The podcast you just heard was published with Anchor. Got something you want to say to the creator of this show? Send them a voice message using the Anchor app, free for iOS and Android.